Hello and welcome to the Sidekick Stories podcast, encouraging conversations about mental health. Today I'm speaking to Radha Shah. Radha, hello.
Hello, thank you for having me here. It's such an important journey to share.
Thank you so much for sharing your story with us. And today, our goal is to have an open and honest conversation about your mental health and to get some insight into the tools and techniques that have helped you. And by discussing your journey, we hope to share and normalise these conversations about mental health as people are not alone in these experiences. Does that sound good to you?
It sounds very, very good.
Awesome. Well, Radha, would love to hear your mental health journey.
It's been a challenging journey, which started off with extreme bouts of loneliness as a child, which I never really understood how to manage, because that support that you want as a child is really important. But I was a latchkey kid. So I was just always coming home on my own and trying to figure out my own homework, feeding myself, and just constantly being around that stage of having to manage everything on my own. And when I thought about it, I realized that the journey did start then, and I developed lots of coping mechanisms. But there's nothing that really supports individuals more than having that love, active love and support when you're in your primitive years. And I'm talking about years probably from 6 to 15. And then when you're a teenager, you don't need that level of support. And very loving family, incredibly loving parents, but they were immigrants. So they were trying to make a mark in the world and, more importantly, put food on the table. Attached to that, you have a huge community of responsibilities. The community never stop arriving for meals and support and landing on your doorstep from abroad, looking for a place to live and a sponsor to get them into the country. So that's sort of how I grew up in the 70s.
And just into the context of that, so you said you grew up. You said you grew up, very lonely, despite having lots of family around you. In what context was that? You said around, where did your parents move from? Where they're moving to? Like you said, was it first generation immigration, and therefore, like you said, your family were finding your feet in effectively a new country, a new world?
Yeah, they came from East Africa, so they came from the Exodus where Idi Amin chucked them all out. So it was they came with a tremendous amount of stress and displacement, and they'd lost a lot of their money. So when they were kings and lords and land and property owners, they came here with very little money. My parents were lucky and they spoke good English because my father had been educated in England, but they still had to start menial roles and working factories and move up the promotional level because, of course, they were immigrants. So I remember a sense of fear always running through the family. And whilst they were excited with new opportunities and they had a tremendous amount of camaraderie and community, because there was a lot of people that had come and they were all in the same boat, and it was, well, we've just got to get on with life. What else can you do? There was certainly a wave of fear and displacement that went through, and I have these vague memories as a child. I think the biggest challenge I faced growing up was there was no one to help with my homework.
Which to you as a young child is the most important thing in your life, right?
That's right. And you touched upon the fact that although I had all these people around me, I felt lonely. And I think that loneliness was because I was so used to being alone that I found it difficult to make connections, and connections which were, I guess, of the similar vibe. Either my cousins were much, much older than me, or they were much, much younger than me. And that friendship and support as a child growing up in the world is so important.
That must have been very difficult in the context also of I assume from you, a mix of cultures. So coming here, were you born here?
I was born in Africa, and I came
Okay.
here when I was sort of 6 years old.
So that is, I mean, the difference, even from your young self and your family self, the difference in culture, and I assume as well the fear from, you know, from that process of immigration, especially given Idi Amin's rule is been known as particularly terrible. There'd be a huge mix of complex emotions, and I can only imagine how hard it was to come here and to like you said, you know, try and make new connections and try and make new friends and try and immerse yourself in a culture where, like you said, it's everything's new.
I don't remember much of it, but one story that sticks out in my head was I was born to a strict vegetarian family. And I went to school and they gave me school dinners. And I think it was livers and kidneys and stuff. And I said, I don't eat this, because I'd been drummed into me, tell them you're vegetarian. But listen, guess what? The British didn't understand this concept of vegetarianism. As the teacher sat me down and said, you know, you have to eat this. And
that must be for you. I mean, even physically, like for the first time in your life to eat meat, that must, you know, that I assume that didn't necessarily go as you know, as well as can be, and I'm sure your family had something to say about that as well.
It was very challenging. So I said, I'm not going to eat it. And the next day I went to school with a little big badge saying no meat.
Yeah.
And so I had my school dinners and they gave me fish fingers. And I said, but I don't eat fish, because they didn't understand this concept of vegetarianism. And no fault of them. That was culturally where we were as a country. The next day I went back to school and and I had the badge said no meat, no fish.
Okay.
And they gave me egg salad. So the third day I went back, no fish, no eggs, no meat. Right. I felt awful because everyone's going, God, you're really, really weird. You're different.
Yeah.
So I think that's where your challenges start. And that's when, as children, we're forced to learn this thing that we talk about today so much, resilience. But you don't know. Yeah. You don't know what all this means.
No. It's complicated now.
Yes. I ended up eating meat eventually, and it's come full circle, because today, if I ever eat meat, my mum and dad will scream at me. And I'm like, but you made me as a child.
Yeah.
You know, and they would cook for me because they wanted me to assimilate into the country.
Yeah.
But now that they've been in the country for well over 50 years, they've had a chance to become very established in their culture, their roots, and as an immigrant community and population, a little bit more settled. They're going back to, well, you know, we're going to be vegetarian and preach it and live it. So there were some of the experiences I felt as a child. I always felt going through university a little bit different. And I think that difference was really what I carried across as a child.
Yeah.
And my first real massive experience with mental health, fear, really anxious thoughts, and a dose of depression came after a really tragic experience in our lives, when my little brother went and killed himself. And
So sorry to hear that.
Thank you. And I didn't know this, but after the incident happened, he'd actually done it before, and he tried it differently. My mum and dad didn't know how to cope. They didn't realize that there was some mental health issues happening here, and perhaps some depression and some support, because outwardly he was so happy. He was a normal child. He wasn't happy in school, but he was very showy and showing that he had a great life. And they thought it was just something that he tried to do. And that was one of the pillars of my mental health, because I couldn't believe that they never did anything for him. And even now, I daren't mention it to them, because to them, they didn't know they could do something. And actually, I wonder, this is going back nearly 40 years, I wonder if there were support systems around like we have today. We have so many opportunities, charities. I get involved in supporting people personally and just giving them love and support, because sometimes that's all you need. And that whole experience made me realize how hard life can be, because to lose a member of your family and to lose it to such tragic circumstances where you've lost a sibling, a loved one, is so, so hard. But the other factor that we had to deal with, which I sometimes feel was a little bit harder, was the community backlash, the underlying challenge of what will the community think and say. Being an Asian, closed, they weren't as progressive as what I call the British community. And so they thought it was a sin. And really, it was just an individual who decided to take his life. Now, look, that's his life. Do we have a judgment on that, whether it's the right thing to do or the wrong thing to do? Can we make a judgment? But judgments were really made, and lots of whispering and lots of talking, and it was just a really horrible experience.
And that time, I can only imagine for you, but also your parents as well, that such a complicated, tragic mix of emotions and feelings. As a having a child myself, it's horrendous, and I'm so sorry that your family have been through that, and it must have been incredibly hard to get the response from the community that there was not perhaps the support that perhaps your family needed.
Today, when we have a bereavement, we have access to bereavement services, we have tremendous support, understanding, and that support and understanding tends to go on a little bit longer in communities, with professional services, where you're looked after for 6 months, a year, 2 years later, and people are more aware of these things happening, tragic circumstances. People die all the time, and we're going through horrific experiences today in the pandemic. And there certainly wasn't that support. It was kind of like, yes, he died, and then you're left all on your own to figure out life.
And to process those complicated, grief is complicated enough, but grief with the tragedy of suicide is staggeringly difficult to even move on from, or not to move on, just to process.
The processing is so challenging, actually trying to understand why he did it. He left a note and he explained that it was just too much for him and he couldn't do it. And he wished us well with everything, which was kind of weird, because the boy's there one day and the next day he's gone. And that memory of the police officer knocking on the door and reporting the death has been etched in my mind forever.
And he said that event, that hugely traumatic event, I assume has like we're having this conversation, has contributed to you needing to deal with your mental health, like in these tragic situations. It's a hugely traumatic event, and how do you process that? How do you even go about that? Because in terms of context, well, what age were you, if you don't mind me asking?
I was 17.
So young, very young, still uncertain about life, and to have that happen is just tragic. And do you feel, you talked about now with bereavement services, do you feel like within your community that if an tragic event like suicide happens now, has there been any opening up?
I still feel there's a massive stigma to it, which I just don't understand.
Yeah.
Because of my growth and my knowledge and my understanding, the last 30 years I've spent understanding death, suicide, loss. my own mental health, that threw me into depression because I couldn't understand what's happening. As you touched upon, being a parent and losing a child is one of the most painful things in the world to go through. And you're always saying to yourself, well, why me? You're questioning yourself, what did I do wrong? Where did I fail as a parent? Because when you're given a little life, that life is yours to manage and grow with.
And that sense of overwhelmed. I mean, I'm overwhelmed now just hearing you talk about it. That overwhelming thought of responsibility of parenthood is it's overwhelming in itself, and having that necessarily taken away from you without necessarily what you could see as a reason, logical reason, and understand that is, with so many unanswered questions, leaves people in an extremely vulnerable and difficult position. And you mentioned your mental health. It pushed you into depression. If you don't mind me asking, how did you and your family, how did you cope?
It was really weird because I don't think my family acknowledged feelings ever. And that's very predominantly, acutely real in South Asian communities. It's not given airing because you're often large families, you're massive communities. So your weekends, many of your evenings are felt at dinners, at events, at functions. You don't have time to sit down and say, I'm feeling upset, because you're in this hamster wheel constantly. So feelings are never really acknowledged. What was the question?
Well, I was just going to say, just on that particular point, like, that's interesting. So there's a very social community, but not necessarily the space to be able to talk about how you're feeling necessarily. Because I would assume, my assumption may be incorrect, like, as part of that big wide social community, there might be a small subsection of those who would be close friends and family that would enable you to kind of have those kind of conversations, but it doesn't necessarily seem like that's the case.
I certainly haven't found it in my community, purely because we're all so busy and we haven't given due respect to how important feelings are, how important emotions are, how to give respect to whatever it is that we're going through. I've learned to value it, to be compassionate, to be kind. And then you've got this whole element of stigma and what will people say, and you're already displaced as a community, and we were still going through that, just like the Jewish community is still learning and grieving and healing from what's happened to them from so many years. And I think that goes through generationally, and I'm hoping that the new generation is a little bit more open and expressive in what they feel. But then we have the new Instagram culture, where we are again hiding behind the truth. And there's nothing wrong with being sad, being upset. And finishing the story about the depression, which is, I think, what you asked me, it wasn't really acknowledged, but I couldn't function. And it impacted my career, impacted my jobs. I kept moving jobs. I couldn't. I'd already gone through lots of challenges as a child. So I had my own mental challenges that I was dealing with. And then on top of that, I have immense grief. And I'm not dealing just with my grief, but I'm also dealing with my parents' grief and my other siblings' grief.
It's a lot to shoulder.
Yes. It's taught me a lot, and I'm very proud of having gone through those stages, because it's given me a tremendous amount of resilience and appreciation for being alive in life. That life will give you these curveballs, and to be a little bit spiritual, that perhaps we signed up for this when we came to this planet. And that's part of maybe the experience that we've signed up for in life.
And it's interesting you meant spirituality. Do you think that you mentioned, like you said, coming from a culture that had been displaced through a fundamentally terrible and violent regime, similarity in some respects to Judaism. Do you feel that generations that have gone through those tragic events are, in some respect, they are so bad, those events, that people don't talk about them, they close up, and what's passed down in generations is that actually we're not going to talk about those feelings, and it requires, like you said, maybe the next generation to say, hold on, we've got to face and acknowledge what's happened and start a process of healing and reconciliation and recovery.
I don't feel that's so important for the East African community, because they've all come here and thrived.
Right. Okay.
I think they were displaced initially. I think the British people welcomed them. England as a country welcomed them, and they were given jobs, homes, opportunities, and they seized them.
Yes.
So I feel they've had their healing, and second generation, third generation, and indeed the fourth generation, which are coming about now, are very comfortable and very settled. Thank you to England. So that healing's happened. But if we talk about things that have happened, like if we talk about when the suicide happened, there was no conversation about it for many years. And it's still a point of, we can't talk about it. And what happens, I think, is that when you don't talk about these things over years, you're just packing them in further and further and further in. Yeah. And it becomes really hard to have discussions. I mean, one thing in my family is that we never discuss my brother, which I feel it's a real big disservice to him. Even something as, oh, he used to love this. But I wonder also, after 30 years, if it's just become a part of life, because we've now lived as a family longer than he was alive. So it's just a point of maybe loss and a tragic experience that happened. But it's certainly an experience that every single one of my family has taken throughout their life, and they will take to their deathbed.
And you talked about the spirituality, and we've got a sense of like you said, within your community, within the South Asian community, to the, let's say, the stigma around the specific subject of suicide. But you said you have coped with your mental health struggles. My assumption is that privately, the other individuals who have been affected by that tragic event have, in some respects, may it be spirituality, may it be privately processed. Do you get this sense there's been a privately processing so that people can cope and move on, rather than that open and shared, which we are talking about and saying, actually, we believe actually talking about it is a really positive thing to process those emotions?
That's a really good point. I think different people process differently. And I shared with you that we're a private community, so that privacy is an individual privacy as well as a community privacy. And maybe I want to talk about it, and not everybody does.
Yeah.
And I know my mother just internalized it and never talked about it ever again. And she wouldn't even talk about it with people, to the extent that if someone said to her, how many children do you have? She would not mention him. And the reason she wouldn't mention him was that if she said, well, I have 4 children, we were maybe on holiday, and there were just the 3 children there, they'd say, well, where's the 4th one? And then she'd say, oh, he went to heaven. And then somebody would express sorrow, and she didn't like that.
No.
Because it was always reminding her of her pain. So she learned to deal with it in a different manner.
Yeah.
And I think the challenging thing that I found, because I want to remember and grow, and remember it was 30 years ago now, is that if we talk about him ever, there's just silence. It's not a remembrance and a fondness. And I'm of the mindset, well, let's celebrate the days that he was here on life. Yeah.
And when you talk about it, and and I know this is extremely difficult and it's a painful conversation, and for those within you know, not just your community, but the whole of the world. How do you feel when talking about it, when you're being open about it? Could I assume there has been some element of you that has been privately processing, but is there a difference between that private processing and openly sharing? Does that open sharing, is that something that you want to do personally, or is it something where you feel actually more people should do that because actually I'm feeling a great, not relief, but, well, in some respects, a relief of those emotions, an outpouring of those emotions that enables you to carry on and cope?
I used to wear it as a stamp as my life story and my personality and my backstory. But I soon realized, well, actually, it wasn't soon, because I was doing exactly that. I wanted to talk about it. I wanted to share with people. I wanted to know I wanted people to know that this is who I was. And this is why I was a little bit fragile and sensitive and had mood swings, because I'd been through this trauma in my life. And it's like when people go through trauma, they're veterans, or they've gone through some mega medical health experience. It changes them as people.
Yeah.
And this experience certainly changed me. And I wore it as a badge. But I soon realized that society outside of my community, just society globally, didn't have the capacity to fathom either the experience, the life change, the trauma, or what it meant to me as an individual. And it's a difficult one, because if somebody did know, I didn't really want to talk about it.
Yeah.
And if someone didn't know, I didn't want them to feel incredibly uncomfortable that I feel like leaving the room.
Yeah.
So we as humans don't appreciate, and that's no judgment, don't appreciate how to manage such experiences.
Yeah. And I completely agree with that. We have, you know, the conversations that we've had on, you know, across the Psychic Stories kind of episodes, is one thing that's really kind of, you know, strung out to me is that, you know, if someone opens up to you with something that is tragic, like silence, and, you know, an uncomfortable silence is not acceptable. You know, we as friends and people and humans need to be comfortable that these things happen, and they happen more frequently than we want to admit. And you know, when someone like, you know, like yourself, Radha, it opens up, it should not be met with uncomfortable silence. It should be met with well, my belief is the acknowledgement that I'm so sorry that is such a tragic event. And if people were scared about what to say, like, just say something that comes from the heart, because that starts a connection, it starts a conversation, or it starts an acknowledgement that, you know, I don't judge you for that comment. And that's really powerful, I think, in terms of building those relationships. It's like, you know, we have a relationship where there's no judgment. Like, you can say what you want. It's a safe space. And this is what I really value about these conversations. And thanking you and everyone else to talking about these honest and open parts of your mental health journeys, which are tragic. But like you said, having those conversations and acknowledging them and having a conversation and dialogue about them is fundamentally important, even if it doesn't come to any resolution. Because these things, is that, you know, especially with your tragic event, it's not going to come to any resolution. You know, it's going to, you know, hopefully we're able to kind of open, like you said, open and process and help you talk about a specific issue, like you said, within your community, where you said, look, you know, this needs to be talked about. We can't keep this silent.
I totally agree with everything that you say. Some transparency, compassion, more understanding from us all as human beings. You know, I read an article the other day, and I was just staggered. And there were some stats they were sharing that 1 in 5 people think about suicide in their lifetime.
Yeah.
When life is so hard, it's so tough, you want to end it all, because you don't see a way forward. And what staggered me further was that 1 in 15, imagine, so 15 of your friends, just as a stat, one person may have considered actually attempted suicide. So that's that's awful that people are doing that, and they're not able to reach out to others when they're at their most vulnerable. And mental health is such a is it okay for me to say this, but it's such a common thing. So having gone through my own journey and being what I feel well read about it, I don't think there's anything unusual about having difficulties with mental health. It used to be, I remember being at school and we would call people loopy, and there was a mental hospital and we would go, well, you belong in the mental hospital. And there wasn't that respect given that if you break your arm or you get flu, it's the same thing. Your mind is an organ. And I think there's still this stigma attached to it. Well, she couldn't cope with the stress and she's had a breakdown. What's wrong with that?
And I think you're right on point with those stats. I heard speaking to a friend, and they're telling me a stat that, in particular to this subject, suicide is the biggest killer in young men in Britain, which I couldn't believe, and that's above cancer. And please forgive me if I got those stats wrong, but that's what I've been told, and that is staggering. And the fact that that is even possible in this day and age where we are actively talking about it suggests that these conversations, whilst they're important, it's very hard to diminish that stigma. And whilst the conversations are brilliant, and having these conversations are important to inspire people to open up and talk about it when they're feeling really, really low, are they affecting the statistics? And that's a real kind of mirror that we need to hold up to ourselves. And whilst we're having these conversations, it's our duty as humans to reach out to our friends and family, and if we are concerned about someone's mental health, to try and help and support in any way that you can. Because I think if you don't, then I feel a sense of it's a huge sense of your responsibility as a human being.
You raise such valuable points that we sometimes don't give full attention to and full thought to.
Do you find that, and in the context of your mental health journey, what tools and tips that have helped you cope over the years? I think we mentioned before we were chatting on the call, you have a daily yoga practice. Is that something that's happened that's really helped you, and what has helped you cope with some very difficult situations in your life?
You know what? I wished when I was younger, people shared with me things to help my mental health. Nobody gives you advice. Nobody gives you thought processes around it. They just say, well, cheer up.
Which isn't helpful, is it? Let's be honest.
It's actually quite annoying.
Yeah, very. Completely agree.
Because you're doing all that you possibly can to manage your thoughts, your feelings, and you're being told to cheer up and be positive. I mean, I think that's the worst thing you can say to someone, and it actually grinds me these days when people just be positive. Well, positivity isn't going to change what I'm feeling. I think what really helped me was having a support structure around me where I had people who I could talk to. I've already shared that I like talking things through, and I would just feel better because those feelings were given validity. And those feelings, which were sometimes going round and round in my head and not making sense, and I was making up stories and narrations in my head, were given a different opinion, maybe a reframe, and a different narration, and poo-pooed often.
Yeah. And sometimes when there's a shared experience where you go, I'm feeling this, is that a bit strange? And they're like, no, I think that all the time. And you're kind of like, okay, that hasn't resolved anything, but it's made me feel better that I'm not, in my mind, I'm not, I don't feel like I'm going mad. And with that particular set of friends, and was that within your community, the South Asian community, or because I just looking at the differences of what you've said between the closed community and like you said, your the great kind of tip and opportunity of having that kind of close group to share those feelings?
It's interesting that you asked me that, because my friends that belonged in that community were still very similar. They wouldn't talk about it. Whereas my friends outside, well, if you ever need to talk about it, I'm here for you.
Yeah.
And they were much more supportive and loving. But I also found over the years that if ever I've shared that with them, they kind of make it a big deal when they see me next time and give me bigger hugs and more love, which is nice.
Yeah.
But it kind of emphasizes it, that, oh, there was something wrong with me. I've been through a little tragedy and it's stayed with me all my life, and people are going to treat me differently now. I didn't want to be treated differently because of that.
It's interesting you saying about the difference, because you said at the age of 6 that you felt different, and that has been a running theme in perhaps how you've connected with your identity as you have grown up through those very formative years. You say, I'm feeling different, I feel different. Like you said, at school, something which for you extremely fundamental about vegetarianism struck you out as different, and like the lack of support with homework struck you out as different. And like you said, that running thought through your mind must have been very, very powerful as you've gone through your life.
Yeah, it's that difference has provided me with a need to always want to be liked. And I realized that I became a pleaser, and I would do everything in my power to be liked, and I would couch it as thinking that I was being nice.
Yeah.
And I'm just a nice person, and you want to lift to the airport, oh, I'll do it for you, we're friends, I'm being nice.
Yeah.
But actually I was going out of my way because I was so scared of not being liked. And once I worked on myself and did some soul searching, realized that this was a behavioral pattern that I was implementing, and I took ownership of it, I think my mental health increased because I was loving me. I was giving myself the time, support, and energy that I needed, and not externalizing it so much. And in helping my mental health, some of the other things that I took up, which made a phenomenal difference to my mental health, was daily exercise. So I've been a daily gym goer for many, many years. Bar it giving me a community, a structure, a routine, it's not overrated when they say that endorphins make a difference in your body, because they give you this buzz for a long time. And of course, you're doing good things to yourself. You're supporting, loving, and keeping your body healthy, which has massive repercussions on your mental health. So I see the two quite actively linked. And I'd like to add a third to that, and that's nutrition. We don't talk enough about how when you eat certain foods, they make you feel, quite frankly, quite shit.
Yeah, they do.
Alcohol being one of them.
Yeah.
And if you're already struggling with challenges with your mental health, why not help yourself? And this is a two-edged sword, because often when you are struggling with mental health and these exact things you need to do, love yourself and like yourself and support yourself, you're not doing it.
No.
Yeah. Because you're so down on yourself.
Yeah.
So I encourage people to try and eat well. And that just includes adding more vegetables and being mindful. What makes you feel bad? Is it the greasy kebab that you have? Is it the excessive alcohol that you had that you don't feel well with? Manage that. And the three of them help me with my mental health, and I can say I'm in a different place. I do get massive periods of anxiety over certain things. COVID was one of them.
Yeah.
And I woke up with anxiety in my stomach. But I've learned to cope with it differently, having a daily yoga practice, making sure that if this anxiety comes up, I have coping techniques like breathing, or I keep saying to myself, because my problem is I think about the future, and I'm very creative, and I make up this massive story about the future, which fuels that anxiety. That's it. I'm anxious for the rest of the day.
Yeah.
So I learned to say, well, this isn't the truth now. And I also learned to give that creativity another channel and find something else which I can be creative about with my mind. So maybe it's writing stories and writing fiction, and getting that energy out of my body really supported me.
And also it's moving the attention away from those catastrophic thoughts. If you are going, like you said, those thought patterns, if you're moving toward, you say, look, this event is making me feel hugely anxious and this is how it's going to play out. But like you said, like, is that, yes, it may play out like that, but there's also an enormous range of other possibilities how it could play out. So acknowledging that actually is not necessarily constructive for you. You say, okay, right, my mind's running away. Let's move to do something else. And I think a daily yoga practice is a great example. It enables you to, and I'm not exactly sure what practice you do, if it's more meditative, if it's more of a flow, if it's more kind of exercise based, but taking that attention away is fundamentally important, because it just allows your mind to just go, okay, right, it puts it in perspective. That situation, right, it's a situation. It's not the present. It's not what is happening. It is a potentiality. I'm going to focus on this for the moment because this is the present.
That's so true. And I think that's one of the challenges, not challenges, that's one of the benefits of yoga, that your practice can be whatever you want it to be.
Yeah.
And the biggest benefit of yoga, which I feel sad I discovered so later on in my life, is that it makes you very present and gives you an intention to work with. So whatever it is you're working with, you can deal with it either through a flow sequence or through pushing out that physical energy in your body through a pose, and you'll feel that energy move, or breathing and meditation.
Yeah.
And I can guarantee that any problem that I'm facing, once I've given some physical movement to yoga, moving, dancing, it changes. It changes.
It's interesting you mentioned that word intention, because in my limited experience of yoga practice, setting the intention is a very important part of it. And I've only come to realize that pairing that intention with your physical practice is very, very important. And you are driving that energy and that physicality towards that intention, which I'd never really quite connected before. But the way you've articulated it makes me think that actually those things pair very, very well. They're coupled together.
It's an absolute conscious way of changing emotion by changing your physiology. So one thing I learned was, when you are walking and you're feeling sad, we look down on the floor, which makes us even more sadder. But if you look up at the sky and you look up the stars and you look up at trees, your physiology changes, your breath changes, and you can feel different. And I've tried this out so many times on my own when I'm dealing with my own emotions and my own feelings.
And it's important to remind yourself to get in a habit of doing these things every day. It's something that we talk about at Sidekick a lot. Like, there are a lot of simple and free things that everyone can do every day to make themselves feel better. And that might be daily exercise, that might be some meditative practice, mindful practice, journaling, whatever it is. But the important thing isn't necessarily what you do, it is taking the time to do it and doing it on a regular basis, so that like you said, your brain and your mind's a muscle. It needs exercise, it needs boundaries. You need to, sometimes it's got too much energy. It needs to, that energy needs to be channeled and released. And it's fundamentally important to build those habits. As my personal experience is, that if you do build in that daily practice, you do feel better, or you are able to cope with very difficult situations. You build your resilience, and that's really, as a human being going through life, they're great assets to have.
Absolutely. And I just like to offer another viewpoint, and it took me a long time to learn this, and it might help one of your listeners, is that it's okay to have these feelings of despair, desperation, failure. They're feelings.
Yeah.
And my life really changed when I was like just accepting them and saying it's just a feeling. And what helped me was actually articulating what the feeling was. If it was anxiety, the feeling was in my chest. The feeling was in my back. Where was it in my chest? Was it the front? Was it the back? And it kind of gave you use that word boundary, but it gave those feelings boundaries. And that was a real game changer for me.
And boundaries, as well as being able to talk through it and label them at the same time, is something we you know, I do hear about, you know, quite a lot, is around being able to articulate and understand and label those emotions is very powerful in itself. I'm not sure I can explain why, but I know that through practice that it does work. It is it's a very straightforward exercise to do it. It requires some thought and some time, but these are things which I believe, and it certainly sounds like you believe, that they are really worth doing every day.
Do you think that when you label them and you're, dare I say, friends with them, the charge of them is less, because you've almost, I feel,
yeah,
they're not controlling me?
I think that's an excellent way to put it. It's, in some respects, by accepting them, you're also embracing them. And the fact is, them is you, but different parts of you, different shards of you that make up the whole that is Radha, that is Matt, whoever that is. And I think acknowledging, but also at the same time, that whilst you're friends with them, they are you, they're valid. You have a overall control. And I always like to put this as that you are the speaker of your house. So if there is a dominant emotion that comes up, maybe some very, you know, deep anger, you know, resentment, grief, whatever it is that has a valid point, and it's important to talk to that emotion and to understand where it's coming from. But that doesn't mean that you need to listen to it. It doesn't mean it needs to dictate your life. You're the speaker, you're in control. If that emotion is valid, but actually not, you know, in proportion to the rest of your emotions, actually is a little bit more extreme, my view is that you can tell that emotion to sit down and say, hold on, this isn't your turn now, sit down. These are the emotions I'm going to focus on. And I do find these kind of visualizations really important. Another visualization that our psychic kind of in-house psychologist talks about is a really powerful one about a lot when your brain starts to kind of go into a manic mode. And I know a lot of people experience this, of imagining your brain on fire and putting a sprinkler system on to cool down the fire. And I find that whilst that isn't necessarily labeling the emotion, but it enables you to deal with, in a very kind of physical way and a visual way, the ability to slow everything down and calm yourself to a point where you are able to start talking to those emotions in a more rational basis.
That's a really lovely technique, and I can see that working. I think the only challenge for all of us is to remember to use it.
100%. 100%, which is why daily practice is important, to remind yourself that, you know, if something does hit you curveball, you do have options to do that.
Fabulous, fabulous, fabulous.
Radha, thank you so much for a fascinating conversation, being so honest and open, sharing some really raw, tragic event in your life. I really, you know, I really am so sorry that you've been through these, for you and your family. I think it's amazing that you are talking about it. I really am, and I really hope that it resonates and inspires with some of our listeners who may have gone through some very similar experiences.
Thank you very much for having me and giving me the space, safe space to talk about my experiences, and it's helped me being able to share. Thank you.
Good, I'm glad. And thank you so much to everyone listening. You can subscribe to us on most major podcast platforms: YouTube, Spotify, Apple Podcasts. Just search for Sidekick Community or Psychic Stories and we'll pop up. And please do give us a rating if you like the show. And you can check out our free Sidekick app for iPhone and iPad. It's a collection of interactive exercises, tools and tips, like the ones we discussed on this episode with Radha, to help you boost your mental well-being. The app enables you to build a personalized well-being toolkit to help you deal with life's ups and downs. Just go to our website, www.sidekick.org.uk, and click the download now button in the header to take you to the App Store. Radha, thank you so much again.